In April 2011, a man in Nantes, France, began sending unusual messages to friends and relatives. He claimed that his family was preparing to leave the country under confidential circumstances. The explanation involved a sudden relocation that could not be verified. Shortly after, his wife and children stopped being seen by neighbors. The family home remained closed, with no visible activity for several days. When authorities eventually entered the property, they discovered multiple members of the family had been killed inside the house. The deaths were confirmed to be deliberate, not accidental. Evidence suggested the events had taken place days before the discovery. The man who had sent those earlier messages was no longer there. His movements after leaving the property could only be partially reconstructed. What began as a family disappearance became an investigation into multiple murders with no confirmed resolution. The investigation began after concerns were raised about the family's sudden disappearance. Authorities were called to the residence in Nantes, France. Upon entry, the interior of the house appeared controlled and orderly. There were no immediate signs of forced entry or visible disturbance. However, further examination revealed concealed areas within the property. Investigators focused on a section of the house that showed signs of modification. The ground beneath the structure had been altered recently. Excavation was carried out under controlled conditions. During this process, the bodies of multiple family members were discovered within the property. The victims were confirmed to be members of the same household. The condition of the site indicated that the deaths had occurred days before discovery. This established that the family had not left the property, as previously suggested. The messages describing relocation did not match the physical evidence. Attention immediately shifted toward the individual who had sent those messages. The adult male resident of the house was no longer present at the scene. No confirmed sighting placed him at the property after the estimated time of death. This created a direct link between the disappearance and the events inside the house. Investigators began reconstructing the sequence of actions that had taken place. The gap between communication and physical evidence became the central focus. The case transitioned from a missing persons report into a confirmed homicide investigation. The last confirmed activity followed a narrow time window. Digital records showed limited outgoing communication after the messages. No incoming responses were acknowledged. No follow-up instructions were provided to any recipient. Local surveillance coverage was minimal, but partially reviewed. No clear footage confirmed a departure from the area. No vehicles were recorded leaving the vicinity at expected times. The parked sedan remained unmoved during this period. Witness statements did not report any luggage being carried out. No unusual noise or disturbance was reported from the residence. Deliveries made to nearby properties continued as normal. No delivery personnel reported interaction at the address. The mailbox continued to receive items without interruption. No attempt was made to clear or collect them. Routine neighborhood activity remained unchanged around the property. The contrast between communication and physical activity became more apparent. Authorities began isolating the final known movement inside the timeline. The gap between claimed departure and observed reality remained unresolved. This discrepancy became the first point of formal concern. Authorities focused on the final known activity linked to the residence. Access points to the property were examined for signs of use. No forced entry was identified on any door or window. Locks appeared undisturbed from the outside. Attention shifted to internal movement patterns. No verified exit sequence could be established. The absence of departure evidence began to suggest containment. Investigators noted the lack of transitional indicators. No staged preparation for travel was visible. No disruption typically associated with sudden relocation was found. The internal timeline began to diverge from the communicated narrative. The messages indicated urgency, but the environment did not reflect it. Surfaces inside appeared controlled and orderly. No visible signs of struggle were initially reported. This created a misleading sense of normalcy. However, the consistency itself raised concern. Investigators began examining what had not changed. The lack of expected disorder became part of the evidence. This shifted the working assumption away from voluntary departure. The incident was no longer being treated as a relocation scenario. Entry into the property was carried out under controlled conditions. Authorities proceeded with a structured internal search. Initial observations did not immediately reveal disruption. Rooms appeared organized and undisturbed at first glance. However, attention was drawn to areas that had been deliberately altered. Sections of the property showed signs of recent modification. Ground surfaces in one specific location appeared inconsistent. Investigators began focusing on that area for closer examination. The soil texture did not match the surrounding environment. This indicated recent disturbance rather than natural settling. Tools were brought in to assess what lay beneath the surface. Excavation was conducted in a controlled and documented manner. What was uncovered confirmed that the timeline had been concealed. The site revealed evidence that contradicted all prior assumptions. The narrative of sudden departure was no longer viable. The property had not been vacated in the way it was described. The location itself had become central to the case. Investigators shifted from search to reconstruction. The focus moved toward understanding how the events had been carried out. The case was now formally classified as a criminal investigation. The investigation expanded beyond the property into external movement patterns. Authorities began mapping all known activities linked to the primary subject. Financial records were among the first data sets reviewed. No large transactions suggested preparation for relocation. Bank activity showed a pattern of controlled, limited usage. There was no indication of long-term financial planning. Travel documentation was then examined in detail. No confirmed bookings were found under any known identity. Cross-border movement records did not match the claimed departure. Attention shifted toward communication logs. Digital activity appeared structured but incomplete. Messages were sent, but responses were not consistently engaged. This created an asymmetry in the communication pattern. Investigators considered the possibility of staged messaging. The timing of each message became a critical variable. Some messages were sent after physical activity had already ceased. This introduced a gap between action and communication. This gap suggested that the narrative was being constructed after the fact. Authorities began testing the hypothesis of premeditation. The investigation was no longer focused on where the family went. It was now focused on how the sequence had been created. Investigators developed multiple working theories based on available evidence. One theory proposed that the subject had successfully left the country. This required bypassing all documented travel systems. No supporting evidence confirmed such movement. Another theory suggested the use of alternate identity pathways. However, no verified documentation linked to a second identity was found. Attention then shifted toward reported sightings. Several individuals claimed to have seen a person matching the description. These sightings were distributed across different regions. Each report was evaluated against established timelines. None aligned with confirmed movement patterns. Inconsistencies began to emerge across all reported sightings. Descriptions varied in detail and accuracy. No single report could be independently verified. The sightings thread began to weaken under scrutiny. A third theory focused on premeditated planning. The controlled communication pattern supported this possibility. The controlled environment at the property reinforced it. However, this theory did not explain the lack of trace afterward. The case remained divided between disappearance and deliberate evasion. No single explanation accounted for all observed variables. The investigation reached a point where all primary leads had been tested. None provided a complete explanation of the sequence. The relocation narrative had been fully dismissed. No evidence supported a coordinated departure. The escape theory lacked logistical confirmation. No verified movement beyond known boundaries was established. The alternate identity theory remained unsupported by documentation. No traceable records confirmed its feasibility. The sightings thread had collapsed under inconsistency. No report aligned with the established timeline. What remained was a pattern of controlled actions. The communication sequence appeared deliberately constructed. The environment within the property reflected planning rather than reaction. The absence of disorder suggested intentional execution. However, the final movement remained unobserved. No definitive endpoint could be established. This created a structural gap in the case. The subject's location after the sequence remains unknown. The investigation concluded without resolving that final variable. The case remains open due to that single missing link.